Ever since Paul Hybert highlighted the flaw of the excluded middle, and even before, missiological communities have tried to navigate ways of engaging culture from a gospel point of view, including their own culture. Culture and spiritual practice are intertwined in much of the world, whether the West sees this overlap or not. Acknowledging this reality has led to a series of specific challenges in El Alto, Bolivia, in supporting women survivors of sexual exploitation. A Word Made Flesh community began in the red light district of El Alto 20 years ago, with the call to walk alongside women in the most vulnerable of situations, prostitution and sexual exploitation. The community grew, and where it once was able to provide only for emergency services and meals, it later grew to develop programs that focused on the holistic needs of women and their children. The first people to walk the red light district and begin meeting women in the brothels quickly realized that a component of prostitution in this context was spiritual practices for the purpose of asking that the brothels have more economic abundance. This presentation will explore two specific stages of spiritual engagement with survivors from the perspective of the Word Made Flesh community. The first stage will represent a very Western model of spiritual engagement in which the spiritual sphere is seen as its own separate sphere that operated parallel to the sphere of physical needs or even parallel to the day-to-day realities of exploitation. In the second stage, I will describe the community's trajectory from merely an anthropological understanding of spiritual practices in prostitution to recognizing that spiritual practices in the red light district are used to oppress, and then to the transformation of spiritual engagement within the Word Made Flesh community to create spaces for liberation. The guiding principles of this analysis are a missiological approach that seeks to recognize the ways the excluded middle of spiritual practices and beliefs in the environment affects both the dynamic of exploitation as well as the liberation from those dynamics. The principles of trauma-informed care also guide this analysis as a community strove to offer tools for restoration from trauma and analyzed how the spiritual spaces offered could help in this process. Finally, Latin American theology that recognizes the spiritual agency of women and recognizes the intersectionality of oppression in their lived experiences helped to design a framework for addressing the multiple layers of oppression and create spaces for liberation. To start off, imagine you come along to visit the red light district with us. And when you step into a brothel, you notice that there is a little altar on one corner of the counter where the administrator sits. There is a large desiccated toad, or sapo, or a statue of a toad. In the toad's mouth, people have placed cigarettes, coca leaves, and around the toad are candles that have been lit, little piles of sugar, and play money, so little paper bills all over. Some places will also have an altar set up with a skull, or a ñatita, or a representation of the devil, or the tío, where people will also leave offerings. Many of these are related or are the owner's personal either effigies or statues. All of the women will also get together in the building, so in the brothel building in August, under the direction of the administrator or owner of the brothel, and set up an offering for the Pachamama, or Mother Earth, as August is the month in which the Mother Earth comes back from its winter rest in the Southern Hemisphere. These are examples of how the women the community works with describe the spiritual rituals in the places of exploitation. If you were to come to the Andean region of Bolivia and Peru where the Aymara people live, cloths spread with offerings will be commonplace. And for the Word Made Flesh community at this time, these altars were part of the cultural environment in which the work to accompany survivors of exploitation was taking place. Just as business owners make altars to ask for a prosperous year, or for the blessing of more merchandise, a bigger store, or a new truck, it made sense that brothel owners and managers would also have altars to request more wealth. At this stage, the community's perception of the role these altars played could be described as anthropological. There was an understanding that the altars were a part of the Andean culture, and women would share that they would also make little altars in their individual rooms within the building, either to the Pachamama or to the god of abundance for safety and protection, so that they could have a good night as far as the money being made. Given this anthropological appreciation, the community offered spiritual activities that reflected an understanding that those practices were a part of the culture, but did not necessarily need to be addressed directly. This meant that there were Bible studies focused on spiritual growth and a right relationship with God. There was also space for conversation around other practices, such as offerings for deceased ancestors on Day of the Dead, which the local evangelical church actively spoke against. However, there was no space to address the spiritual dynamic that the women had experienced in the places of exploitation themselves. That takes us to part 2, a transformed spiritual engagement. A turning point for spiritual accompaniment of survivors came when this author conducted a case study in order to document women's experiences with spiritual and religious practice before entering prostitution, during prostitution, and after leaving prostitution behind. It was in conducting this research that the 2 levels of spiritual practice within the red light district became clear. The first level I've already described, and it includes the altars created by the owners, the general practices of asking for wealth and material blessing, and the individual practices of the women requesting wealth. The second layer of spiritual practice within the places of exploitation was more ominous. Women began to speak of specific instances where the owners and administrators of the brothels would get all of the women together and incorporate the women themselves into the rituals as objects. The women described rituals where a star would be painted on the floor of the brothel, and it would be filled with sugar, cinnamon, and the owners would put cigarettes in the corners. After completing the star, the owners would have all of the women stand around the star, jump up and down, and then the owner would go around and gently hit each woman with a notebook where each one was registered and where a tally of the clients was kept. Similarly, there was another ritual where a line of sugar was made on the ground and women were made to jump over it twice. The women also described being grouped together and swatted with branches of flowers and where they were made to smoke cigarettes. All of these practices were obligatory for the women, and the owners would say that it was so the women's faith in the brothel would grow. There were also rituals where the owners would douse alcohol on the ground and make offerings before opening in order to call the women to the building. This ritual was practiced intentionally to tie a woman to that one place, and the women themselves would share that they were afraid of what might happen to them if they did not go. Making the women participate in offerings within the building, usually to the owner's personal effigy, statue, or skull, was also a way to bind the women to that place. The descriptions shared by these women show a transition from being active participants that join in a spiritual practice to becoming objects of the spiritual rituals themselves. Their objectification was carried out in these rituals in order to ask for more abundance, and also in order to spiritually tie or bind the women to the places of exploitation, or in some cases, bind them to the owners of the buildings themselves. These rituals demonstrated that spiritual practices are used oppressively to maintain women in a position of dependence and subjugation in the centers of exploitation. Upon recognizing this dimension, the community realized that our approach to spiritual accompaniment needed to change. 2 main principles guided this change after hearing from the women's experiences. The first was the need to recognize the fully embodied experiences with spirituality and oppression the women had faced. This was to redress how we had neglected this aspect before. Secondly, we needed to recognize the need for transformed spiritual places as a tool for post-traumatic healing in response to how spiritual practices had been used traumatically in the places of exploitation. The first step of recognizing the embodied experiences of the women we were serving meant recognizing ways we had neglected how spirituality infuses everyday life in our context, even in sexual exploitation. We do not experience spirituality or belief merely on a rational level, but our practices and our rituals include our full embodied self in the spiritual dialogue. This principle of embodiment has deep implications when we realize that our bodies and their bodies specifically in this case, were being used not just symbolically in rituals, but very explicitly as objects to be prayed over and blessed for the purpose of further exploitation, or in the owner's vision, to receive more income. Women would still experience the fear in their bodies of having gone through the rituals that bound them to the owners or to the physical spaces themselves. and knowing the consequences that were threatened over them if they left or did anything to harm the place. Any step forward in offering spiritual spaces would need to address this lived dynamic of objectification. Secondly, many studies have been conducted in the last few years showing the importance of spirituality for trauma healing. With this, as part of the justification for our programming, we knew that it was not an option to simply discard the women's experiences of objectification and risk falling again into the flaw of excluding that middle space of spiritual activity. This renewed appreciation for providing a spiritual component to accompaniment allowed us to hold up a mirror to previous programming and recognize where our very methodology had also been complicit in reinforcing hierarchies of spiritual understanding, where, for example, we were the knowledgeable ones, passing on the information to others who didn't know as much. In recognizing that model only reinforced the idea of others having a spiritual authority over the women, we were able to revise and work to create new spaces for spiritual engagement, for equal spiritual engagement, following theological principles that recognize the spiritual agency of all people and creating communal spaces of spiritual growth. Finally, by recognizing that spirituality and spiritual practices were transversal to the women's experiences of sexual violence and exploitation, the community was able to recognize the need for healthy spiritual practice to also be a transverse component in the women's process of healing. This meant creating spaces where spiritual conversations and growth are encouraged, following the principles of trauma-informed care. A few of these principles are removing the dynamic of spiritual power over others by encouraging everyone to engage with the text and participate freely. No one has all of the answers. Rather, we encourage dialogue and questions. In this environment, survivors of sexual exploitation are active participants, agents of their own growth, and they experience liberation from oppressive spiritual practices that tied them to the centers of exploitation to begin with. To conclude, let's reflect on a well-known biblical story. The story of the woman found in adultery in John 7 and 8 paints a vivid picture of the shame surrounding a woman failing at religious standards of righteousness. She is brought by teachers of the law before Jesus, and as a way of a trap, he is asked what they should do with her. While the teachers of the law know full well that the punishment for being caught in adultery is stoning. This is a quintessential example of religious structures and a twisted spirituality being used to oppress the vulnerable. The woman was taken alone before Jesus. The presumed male accomplice in this adultery is nowhere to be found. She is dragged to the temple itself by a group of men who have knowledge in the law and therefore have a position of power and prestige in the community that is far above her own position. Both because the possibility of being a student of the law was not open to her, and because she was a woman. Finally, she is cast before Jesus, huddling on the ground, I imagine simply waiting to feel the weight of the first stones fall on her. Jesus sees this situation for what it is, the manipulation of the law to prove a point, and a point that would result in a vulnerable woman receiving a death sentence. In recognizing this, Jesus engages with the teachers of the law and liberates the woman from the oppressive spiritual system, not just in the sense of saving her from her sins, but in saving her life from a sure death sentence and inviting her to step into renewed agency over her own actions. Go and sin no more. Much like the abuse of religious practice in this story, spiritual practices are used to keep women tied to the brothels and as tools themselves for oppression in our experience in El Alto, Bolivia. The spiritual practices that play a role in oppressing women in the red light district present a challenge of engagement for the Word Made Flesh community. At first, though the practices were known of, we treated them simply as a characteristic of the brothels, or as a characteristic of the wider culture in which we inhabited. This influenced, of course, the creation of spiritual spaces in the drop-in center, as Bible studies addressed spiritual truths without necessarily inviting engagement or liberation from oppressive structures. The recognition of the reality of spiritual oppression has led to a transformed spiritual engagement within the community that actively works to liberate from oppression and allow space for survivors to grow in their own spiritual agency. In the Altiplano of Bolivia, we have been invited into this reimagining of a liberating spiritual dynamic, where survivors step into their empowerment as agents of their own spirituality and relationship with God, no longer the objects of someone else's desires. Where we learn together about the God who frees us from systems of oppression, be they sexual, social, or spiritual, and where we are invited to witness all things being made new. Thank you.